Hi, good evening, everybody. Welcome back to our Tuesday evening, our Tech Tuesday. And I'm going through the skeletal or the musculoskeletal system at present. Last week, we covered the basics of the skeleton and sort of the superstructure of our body. The part that our skin and organs hang on is the skeleton. And this week, we're going to do a little bit more of a fill in and get to the other bits and pieces that happen with the skeleton, which is the muscles and ligaments. And we're going to go through all of that. Let me just mute everybody. Most of you are muted anyway. And I will share my screen. Shrink me down so I can't see me. And get rid of that. And run our slideshow. All right, so as I was saying, we are busy with the musculoskeletal system, never mind just the skeleton, because the skeleton basically is all of your bones. All 206 of our bones make up the skeleton, including the loose flappy ones that are flapping in the breeze, and we do have a couple of those, but I'm not going to get into the technical bits as far as that's concerned. And this week we're going to go into the next part, which is the interactions between the skeleton, the muscles, and the nerves that all work together to move the body. So every time that you move a finger, there's a lot of things that are happening, from signals running from the brain through the spinal cord to the individual muscles and ligaments and sensory bits and pieces. So it might just look like a simple little movement of the finger, but there's an awful lot of work goes into that to get that finger movement. So how does the skeleton move? The muscles throughout the human body are attached to bones. If you think of a tent, for instance, think of a circus tent. You put up a tent, you got your big main poles. That is technically our skeleton. Then you've got the tent itself that comes over those poles, which is the skin. And then you've got all of your guy ropes. Now, if you've ever put up a tent and you have a slack guy rope, I think you know what happens, because while the tent will stand, the smallest little movement or the smallest little bit of a breeze will cause that tent to implode or fall over. Tighten up the guy ropes, and suddenly that tent can put up and can survive pretty much a gale force wind. Now you think of the main poles as the skeleton, the tent as the skin, and the guy ropes as our muscles and ligaments. If they are firm and fit, we're going to work and move a lot more easily. If they are weak or damaged, we're not going to move quite so easily, and we're going to tend to fall over. And the nerves around a muscle can signal the muscle to move. So when you think about moving a finger, that signal runs down from the brain via the spinal cord into the arm through all the different little synapses and everything, going down to the muscles to say, bend the finger. And then if I want to straighten it, there's another series of information that goes along and says, straighten the finger. So I don't, sorry, I don't really have time to get into all the little bits and pieces, but I find it fascinating. And possibly because I'm working with this on a regular basis, the more I see about things that happen in the body and how the body works or sometimes doesn't work, the more fascinated I become. So if ever you come and visit me and you've got an injury, I'm going to ask you about 20 million questions as to what caused the injury, how did it happen, because that explains to me which nerves, which muscles, which bones are involved, And from that perspective, I can then deduce more or less what sort of injury we're looking at, especially if it's a soft tissue that doesn't show up on X-ray. And then I can work out what we're going to do to support and help to get you back moving comfortably again. So when the nervous system sends commands to the skeletal muscles, the muscles contract. That contraction produces movement at the joints between the bones. So between every single bone, so all 206 bones, there are joints. Some of those joints, like your skull, for instance, have now become fused with time and no longer move. When a baby is born naturally, the skull compresses down. So essentially, there are joints between your skull bones. As we grow and develop, those solidify. Same with the bottom end of your spine, which is your sacrum area, where your coccyx is. I won't get into all the fancy words, but I think most people know where the coccyx is. And the last little bit of the spine is all fused. Even your pelvis is fused, but initially it was flexible. So when that contraction produces movement at the joints between the bones, you have bends like in the middle of your fingers or your hands or your wrists. I hope you can see what I'm doing, or even your neck. Those are all indications to move certain muscles and certain bones. It's a very clever little concept. Now, what's the difference between ligaments and tendons? We hear these words of muscle and ligament and tendon. And so the tendon attaches the muscle to the bone. So if you feel down your leg and you feel your calf muscle, which is a big part, it attaches to the Achilles tendon, or should I say the calf goes down into the Achilles tendon. There's my little cursor. So there's your calf muscle going into the Achilles tendon, which attaches to the heel bone or the calcaneus. That's the fancy term for it. So from the side, there's your calf, Achilles tendon attaching to the bone. Now your knee has ligaments, and the knee is quite a complex little joint because it doesn't just bend, it bends, slides, and it rotates, and it is controlled by a group of 6 different ligaments. So it's a very complex joint. And we seem to be going through knee season at the moment because I've had a couple of knee injuries just today. Not on myself, but on patients that I'm working with. So the ligaments attach bone to bone, and you will find them mostly in the big joints like the knee and the elbow, for instance. Ligaments and tendons are both made up of fibrous connective tissue, but that's about where the similarity ends. And if you think of these things like if you've ever been in, or if you've been on the cruise or you've been in the harbor and you've seen a ship with these massive, great big ropes, that is more or less how your ligaments and tendons are made up. It's a lot of little fibers joined together into a thick rope. And ligaments appear as crisscross bands that attach bone to bone, and they help to stabilize joints. And the knee is a classic example of that, because the 2 ligaments in the middle of the knee are called the cruciates because they cross over, and they control this movement and this movement to a certain extent. For example, the anterior cruciate ligament, otherwise known as ACL, which I don't have a picture of it over here, but it's in the middle of the knee there, attaches the thigh bone to the shin bone. The thigh bone being your femur, which is this one over here, the shin bone being your tibia, which is this one over here. And the tendons, which are located at each end of a muscle, remember I said calf muscle and tendon, and also from calf muscle into tendons going up towards the knee as well, attach the muscle to the bone. And the tendons are found throughout the body, from the head and the neck all the way down to the feet. The Achilles tendon is the largest. That's this little guy over here. It's the largest tendon in the body, and it attaches the calf muscle, here's my cursor, there to the heel bone. And if that snaps, which is a relatively common sports injury, quite often in soccer players or cricket players, if that snaps, it's very painful and it is a long repair. It can be repaired surgically, but the recovery can be between 9 to 12 months. It's quite a nasty if you do a really good job of it. The rotator cuff tendons help your shoulder to rotate forward and backwards. And that's these little guys up here. Another common injury in cricket players, for instance, baseball players. I've had a farmer injury rotator cuff by putting up his hand to stop some bales of hay that were falling off a truck. He simply put his hand up to catch it, and it popped it down and knocked his rotator cuff out of position. Also, if you fall and land on your shoulder, you're going to damage your rotator cuff. So there's a few different things that you can cause damage to a rotator cuff. But now, how do the ligaments and the tendons work? This is just a very basic picture of going from your thigh muscle, basically, going to tendon, to kneecap, which is bone, to ligament from the bottom of the kneecap and around the knee to bone again. And you can think of ligaments as rope with a series of tough intertwined cords that bind bones together. Ligaments also have some elastic fibers that allow the joint to move, but not so much that it moves beyond its capacity. Because when that happens, it hurts. Imagine your wrist. I want a little bit of movement, but I don't want to be able to pull it out this far. I've seen injuries like that. It's not fun. So what happens when you're riding a motorbike or a quad bike? The bike stops and you don't, and you go over the handlebars, and it tends to dislocate the wrists. Not a pleasant injury. The knee joint, for instance, has 4 major ligaments, one on each side of the knee, and 2 that run diagonally across the front and the back of the kneecap. These ligaments help to stabilize the knee and keep it from moving too far to the left or to the right, as well as forward or back. Tendons are also tough cords, but they have a little more give than ligaments. So it's almost like a safety part of your body, because if you tear a ligament, it heals more easily and more quickly than if you tear a ligament. It's just how it works. As a muscle contracts, the attached tendon pulls the bone into movement. So it's a whole complex system. Think of what happens to your bicep when you bend your elbow. I won't demonstrate that right now, but it's basically that sort of thing. Pardon me. Tendons also help to absorb some of the impact muscles take as they spring into action. Whenever you're walking, your tendons in your knee are absorbing the impact of the shock of the floor. So whenever you walk, you've got gravity pushing down from the skull area, basically, and you've got the shock of the floor pushing up. And if you've ever been to school and know Newton's laws, you'll know what happens. That shock travels up through the body. So imagine driving your car with no shock absorbers. That's what happens if we don't have muscles and tendons on our body. We would end up with very rattly jaws. So what injuries are commonly seen in ligaments and tendons? And this is where I kick in my day job, because this is the sort of thing I see quite regularly. So you've got some examples over here. This is somebody who's damaged their ligaments in their ankle. It's what happens if you're running parkrun and find a hole in the floor and you roll over. We end up looking like this, or just missing a step. Simple as that. And this is your classic, what we call ACL or anterior cruciate ligament injury. It's when the knee twists, and you'll find that quite commonly in sports like soccer, rugby, karate, squash, all those sort of things where there's quite a bit of rotation forces happening in the knee. Sorry. So when a ligament is overstretched or torn, it results in what's technically known as a sprain. Now you get a strain, you get a sprain, and then you get a tear. Again, we don't have to worry about all the technical bits and pieces, but there's different levels of injury. Many sprains happen suddenly, either from a fall, awkward movement, or a direct blow. Sprains commonly happen in the ankle, the knee, or the wrist. And when a tendon is overstretched or torn, it's known as a strain. Jenny can explain a lot more of that from a first aid perspective too. Common areas affected by strains are the leg, foot, and back. Strains are often the result of habitual movements and athletics, what we commonly refer to as a repetitive strain movement. So if you regularly bending down and picking up something off the floor, think of moms picking up babies, think of domestic workers bending down, picking up laundry, secretaries, etc., bending down, picking up files, even teachers for that matter, picking up files. You're bending your back regularly, and that's where you strain it. Nurses as well. Athletes who overtrain their bodies without adequate time for rest and muscle repair in between workout sessions are also at increased risk. Tendonitis, which is another tendon injury, is an inflammation of the tendon. And you can see that in the word by seeing tendon, obviously referring to these tissues. And itis, anytime you see the word itis, it means inflammation. That often happens with repetitive strain injuries. And this can recur as a result of the natural aging process as well, partly because as we get older, we lose our flexibility. If you've ever seen pictures of 98-year-old ex-gymnasts, they're still quite flexible. If you didn't do gymnastics later and continued to do it, you're probably not going to be able to do the splits without some serious pain. Like other parts of the body, tendons weaken as we age, becoming more prone to stress and injury. Sadly, that happens to everybody. So now, what are musculoskeletal disorders? These are conditions that can affect your muscles, bones, and joints. And they include things like tendonitis, carpal tunnel syndrome, osteoarthritis, osteo meaning bone, arthritis simply meaning inflammation of the joint, rheumatoid arthritis, again, arthritis, inflammation of the joint. Rheumatoid is an inflammatory condition, autoimmune condition as well, just by the way. Fibromyalgia, which is basically pain involving muscle fibers. Bone fractures are some of the more common things. Also things like tennis elbow, golfer's elbow, and various other fun names that we come up with, like shin splints and plantar fasciitis and other jaw spreaders over there. But can we prevent this possibly? Can we make it easier? Can we heal ourselves by giving the body the correct tools? And the correct tools, as we know, is food. So how do we eat right for our body? First question is, are you eating to maintain a healthy body or just eating for the fun of it? Currently, 1 in 4 people suffer from musculoskeletal conditions, and these conditions increase with unhealthy lifestyle choices. And I see this regularly. One key component to obtaining a healthy lifestyle and decreasing your risk for musculoskeletal conditions is eating a proper balanced diet, which is high in vitamins and minerals. You combine this with regular physical exercise, with a healthy diet, and you're well on your way to reducing your risk for musculoskeletal conditions. And I must say, again, I'll come back to parkrun because that's my main fun exercise. Because of our local parkrun is on a very uneven terrain, technically it's a trail run, and there are lots of hidden potholes and things. I have fairly regularly rolled my ankle when running, but I feel partly I am still relatively flexible, thank goodness, but also I think because I've been giving my body the correct nutrition, my ankle will roll and immediately come back again and I can carry on. But I've witnessed, and then obviously patched them up later, people doing a similar sort of thing. They roll their ankle and instantly there's a tear in that ligament because there's not sufficient elasticity in that tendon to be able to go and pull back again. A lack of proper nutrients increases your risk for bone, muscle, and joint disease. Therefore, it is very important to know which foods can help ward off the risks and set you up for a positive, healthy lifestyle. We all know about osteoporosis that comes along with age. There's another term over there called osteopenia, which is sort of the precursor to osteoporosis. And that's simply your bone, which we think of as a hard thing. Bone is actually flexible. And unless we give it the correct nutrients, it's not going to bend and it's going to snap. And what I find quite distressing is seeing the number of young children with broken bones. Because a child should have a very flexible skeleton and it should take significant force to cause a fracture. Worst case should be what they call a green stick fracture. But I'm seeing clean breaks in things like the thigh bone or the femur, things like the wrists, in young children. I'm talking 5, 6-year-olds who have fallen, sometimes tripped over their own feet, fallen from their height, which is not very high, and they shatter. For me, that is very distressing and scary. You can understand it for somebody who is 98 or 99 because their body isn't as flexible anymore, and you expect them to break, but not young children. Physical activity and a balanced diet may also reduce the occurrence of injuries and accidents and may reduce the development of musculoskeletal conditions such as back pain, osteoarthritis, and osteoporosis. So what are these foods? Here's just a little example of some of the best diet and foods for osteoporosis, including things like dairy products, which a lot of people are not having anymore. Fortified foods, fish, fruits and vegetables. We're not getting those things in the amounts that we should be getting. And according to the International Life Sciences Institute, osteoporosis can result from inadequate consumption of calcium and vitamin D intake, and they are recommended as part of a healthy diet. To give you an example of what osteoporosis actually is, if you had to cut through a piece of bone, a healthy bone should look like the inside of a crunchy chocolate. If you've ever had a crunchy chocolate, the golden honeycomb, that is what the inside of a healthy bone should look like. Quite often, unfortunately, your osteoporotic bone looks more like the inside of an Aero chocolate. If you break an Aero chocolate, you'll see there's a lot of bigger bubbles. That's an osteoporotic bone. Now, both of the nutrients of calcium and vitamin D are important to help improve musculoskeletal health. Calcium helps build bone tissue, whereas vitamin D promotes the absorption of the calcium itself. So you can have the calcium from the dairy, for instance, but if you're not getting the vitamin D, the calcium isn't being absorbed. And as we have learned over the years, from our little cellular pictures, if the cell can't absorb the nutrient, it's a little bit, as I like to describe, climbing into the shower while wearing a raincoat. You may get a little damp, but you're not going to get very wet. So you may get some calcium, but you're not going to get the correct amount that you need to be getting. Sorry. So what are some of the sources of these foods? Protein is necessary to gain bone mass during childhood and adolescence, and it helps to preserve bone mass as we age. So your bone is building and growing and thickening and strengthening upwards of about 20 to 25 years of age. After that, we are starting to lose bone density more rapidly than we're able to replace it, unless we are supplementing. So even if you are having a good, healthy diet, you probably are losing out on things like calcium and protein to build the muscle density and the bone density. Foods high in protein include things like fish, like salmon, mackerel, sardines, legumes like kidney beans, lentils, chicken. And I'm going to add on that one, I would suggest free-range chicken, not farmed chicken, because farmed chicken, the nutrients are not quite optimum. Nuts and seeds like almonds, cashews, pine nuts, flaxseed, etc. Dairy like Greek yogurt, cottage cheese, eggs, another good source. And then we have things like magnesium. We need to add fruits and vegetables to our diet because that has many benefits to your health. They contain an array of vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, and alkaline salts. Studies have shown higher fruit and vegetable consumption is associated with positive effects on bone density in elderly men and women. I don't think any of us are considered elderly on this particular program. Do you know that magnesium plays an important role in forming bone mineral? In fact, magnesium contributes to the structural development of bone. As you age, magnesium absorption decreases and may increase the risk of fractures. Foods that are high in magnesium, I'm going to wrap up shortly, include things like green vegetables, legumes, fish, nuts and seeds. The other thing that we need to look at is maybe this is one that you haven't considered, and that is vitamin K. We think about adding vitamin C and vitamin D to our diet, but vitamin K is equally important. Vitamin K is needed for the mineralization of bone. So calcium helps to develop bone. Vitamin D helps to absorb the calcium into the bone and give bone density. But vitamin K helps in the mineralization to give you your bone density. Foods high in vitamin K include things like lettuce, spinach, cabbage, soybean products. And for bone tissue to renew and mineralize, zinc is required. And a severe deficiency is usually associated with caloric and protein malnutrition and contributes to impaired bone growth in children. And Don Lawson's got a very interesting comment about zinc specifically, where apparently it was, I think it was in Iran, the young children were eating clay for some weird reason. And that was impeding the absorption of zinc. And as a result was they were falling and breaking bones more regularly and more easily. So milder degrees of zinc deficiency have been reported in the elderly and could potentially contribute to poor bone structure due to its role in regulation of bone formation and resorption. And you can supplement with zinc, but there are also ways to add it into your regular diet. Foods that are high in zinc are things like red meat, poultry, whole grain cereals, legumes again. And these are just a few nutrients to consider as you prepare your food for the day. Adding some key elements to your diet could help play a preventative role with certain musculoskeletal conditions, especially as you age. And that is where I'm going to stop for now, because we're going to get into what is recommended by Neolife next week. So again, a good, healthy, balanced diet is obviously the key. But if you're not getting it, and I know I'm not getting it from my food, we need to supplement. But we need to supplement correctly. So I hope everybody could see my actions on there, because I couldn't see me. So hopefully you got a few of the things that I was trying to describe over there. Let me just stop over here.